I came home on a Thursday afternoon to a shattered kitchen window, glass scattered across the floor in a pattern that struck me, even in that first disoriented moment, as somehow too deliberate, too evenly distributed to have come from an actual point of impact, and it would take me nearly 3 weeks to fully understand exactly why that specific detail had bothered me before I even consciously registered what was missing from my jewelry box upstairs. My name is Adrienne Foster, I'm 38 years old, and this is the story of the burglary that never actually happened, the police report that named a thief who never existed, and the specific, quiet moment I finally understood that my own husband had turned our house into a crime scene, not to protect us from anyone, but to give himself cover for exactly where my grandmother's jewelry had actually gone. I need to describe that afternoon in considerable detail, because the specific sequence of what I noticed, and what I initially, understandably dismissed, matters enormously to understanding everything that followed. I'd come home from a dentist appointment around 2 in the afternoon, pulling into our driveway in the quiet, tree-lined suburban neighborhood outside Richmond, Virginia, where my husband, Nathan, and I had lived for 11 years, raising no children but building, or so I genuinely believed at the time, a stable, comfortable life together. I worked as a curriculum coordinator for the local school district, a job with reasonably predictable hours that had, over the years, made me the one who was almost always home first, the one who noticed first if anything in our household seemed even slightly out of place. I noticed, walking up to the front door that Thursday, that something felt wrong before I even fully understood what it was, the specific, low-grade unease that arrives before conscious recognition catches up to whatever your senses have already registered. The kitchen window facing our side yard, the one above the sink where I kept a small collection of potted herbs, was broken, a jagged hole roughly the size of a dinner plate, glass scattered both inside on the kitchen floor and, I noticed almost immediately upon stepping closer, oddly, outside on the ground beneath the window as well. I remember standing there for a long moment, house key still in my hand, feeling my heart rate climb steadily before I'd even processed a single coherent thought about what I was actually looking at. I called 911 standing in our own driveway, my hands shaking in the specific way hands shake when your body understands something alarming has happened before your mind has fully caught up to it, and I want to be honest that in that first hour, surrounded by 2 responding officers walking carefully through our house, I felt nothing but straightforward, uncomplicated fear and violation, the ordinary, entirely understandable reaction of anyone discovering their home had apparently been broken into while they were out running an errand as mundane as a dental cleaning. The responding officers, a patient, thorough woman named Officer Delgado and her considerably quieter partner, Officer Whitmore, walked me through the house room by room, documenting what appeared, on its surface, to be a fairly standard residential burglary. Our bedroom had been the most visibly disturbed room in the entire house, drawers pulled open with a specific kind of urgency, my jewelry box on the dresser appended, its contents largely scattered and mostly gone. I want to describe exactly what was missing, because the specific selection of items would eventually matter considerably more than I understood in that first devastated hour. Gone was my grandmother's diamond and sapphire ring, passed down through 3 generations of women in my family, a piece I'd always kept in a small velvet pouch inside the jewelry box specifically because of its considerable sentimental and historical significance to our family. Gone was a gold bracelet that had belonged to my mother, a delicate piece she'd worn nearly every day of my childhood. Gone, too, were a pair of pearl earrings I'd worn myself at our own wedding 11 years earlier, a detail that struck me, standing in that ransacked bedroom, as somehow the cruelest specific loss among everything taken. Strangely, left behind, scattered across the dresser as though dropped in haste during a hurried search, were several pieces of costume jewelry worth considerably less than what had actually been taken, along with, oddly, an actual antique pocket watch of Nathan's that had belonged to his own grandfather, sitting entirely untouched in its case on his side of the dresser, a detail Officer Delgado noted in her report but didn't comment on further at the time, simply observing that burglars sometimes take items seemingly at random, prioritizing whatever appears most immediately valuable or portable rather than conducting any kind of careful, considered selection. Nathan arrived home about 40 minutes after I called the police, having rushed back from his law office once I reached him by phone, and I remember, even in the fog of that afternoon, noticing that his reaction struck me as slightly performative in a way I couldn't yet fully articulate to myself, a specific, visible urgency to his concern that felt, somehow, calibrated for an audience rather than simply, privately, genuinely felt. He hugged me tightly, asked repeatedly whether I was hurt, walked through the house alongside the officers asking pointed, specific questions about exactly which items had been taken, and generally behaved, on the surface, exactly like a husband appropriately alarmed by a break-in at his own home. I want to be honest that at the time, I registered none of this as suspicious. Grief and fear have their own particular logic, and I simply absorbed his presence that afternoon as comfort, nothing more complicated than that. The police report filed that afternoon listed the missing items in careful detail, noted the apparent point of entry through the broken kitchen window, and explained, in Officer Delgado's careful, professional language, that our specific neighborhood had unfortunately seen 2 similar break-ins over the preceding 6 months, giving the entire incident an immediate, plausible context that made it considerably easier for me, in that first devastated week, to simply accept the explanation being offered rather than examine it more closely. I filed an insurance claim for the missing jewelry the following week, working through the specific, tedious documentation process with a claims adjuster named Marcus Feldman, who asked, patiently and repeatedly, for old photographs, appraisal records, anything that could help establish the value of what had actually been taken from us. I want to spend some time describing the weeks immediately following the burglary, because the specific texture of that period matters considerably to understanding how completely I initially failed to suspect anything beyond the surface explanation I'd been given. Nathan was, if anything, considerably more attentive during that first month than he'd been in years, bringing home flowers unprompted on 2 separate occasions, suggesting we install a home security system, which we did within 2 weeks, and generally performing, I understood only much later, exactly the kind of concerned, protective husband a genuinely innocent man might reasonably become after his own home had been violated. I remember specifically feeling grateful, during that period, for what I interpreted as a renewed closeness between us, a silver lining, however small, to an otherwise traumatic experience. Looking back now, I understand that closeness for what it actually was, the specific, careful performance of a man managing an elaborate deception, ensuring I remained comfortable and unsuspicious while the actual, underlying situation continued developing entirely outside my awareness. I want to explain the specific detail that first, quietly began bothering me, because it took nearly 3 weeks before I let myself fully examine why. Working through old photographs for the insurance claim one evening, searching through our shared cloud photo account for any images that happened to show my grandmother's ring or my mother's bracelet, hoping to find something clear enough to submit alongside the appraisal documents Marcus had requested, I came across a photograph from roughly 4 months earlier, taken at a company holiday party Nathan's law firm had hosted at a downtown hotel, that I had genuinely, completely forgotten existed. It showed Nathan standing with a small group of colleagues near an elaborately decorated bar, and standing just beside him, her hand resting lightly on his forearm in the casual, easy way colleagues sometimes stand for a photograph together, was a woman I recognized, after a moment, as Celeste Whitfield, a newer associate at his firm I'd met perhaps twice at previous work functions over the preceding 2 years. I almost scrolled past that photograph entirely, searching specifically for jewelry-related images rather than examining the broader photo library closely for anything else. But something about Celeste's specific position in that photograph, the particular, easy familiarity of her hand on his forearm, made me pause longer than I otherwise might have, and I found myself, almost without consciously deciding to, scrolling backward through several additional months of photographs, specifically looking now for any other images that happened to include her. What I found, over the following hour, sitting alone at our kitchen table with my laptop while Nathan worked late at the office, was a pattern I had genuinely never once noticed while actually living inside our marriage during that same period. Celeste appeared in considerably more photographs across the preceding year than any other single colleague of Nathan's, always positioned somewhere nearby him in group settings, always with that same easy, comfortable familiarity I'd initially, understandably dismissed as entirely unremarkable, the ordinary closeness of 2 colleagues who worked together frequently. I found, specifically, a photograph from a work conference roughly 7 months earlier, time-stamped and geotagged to a hotel in Charlotte, North Carolina, showing Nathan and Celeste standing together outside what appeared to be a restaurant, considerably later in the evening, according to the timestamp, than any legitimate work dinner would reasonably run. I sat with that discovery for several days before I did anything further, understanding, with a specific clarity I didn't fully trust yet given everything else we'd both been through, that I needed considerably more information before I confronted Nathan with anything at all, particularly given how recently we'd both experienced what I still, at that point, genuinely believed had been an actual, frightening burglary. I didn't want to conflate two separate crises if they genuinely turned out to be separate, entirely unrelated matters, but some careful, methodical instinct told me I needed to understand exactly what I was actually dealing with before I said a single word out loud to anyone, including my own husband. I want to explain the specific decision that ended up unraveling everything, because it happened almost entirely by accident rather than through any deliberate investigation on my part at that particular stage. Roughly 3 weeks after the burglary, going through Nathan's home office one Saturday afternoon while he was out playing golf, searching for a specific document our insurance adjuster had requested regarding a previous, unrelated claim we'd filed years earlier, I opened a desk drawer I rarely had reason to access, looking for an old file folder I remembered him keeping somewhere in that general area, and found, instead, tucked beneath a stack of tax documents from several years back, a slim, unmarked manila envelope that seemed, immediately, oddly out of place among the otherwise carefully organized files surrounding it. Inside was a single receipt, from a jewelry appraiser and consignment shop called Heritage Fine Jewelry that I'd never once heard of in 11 years of marriage, dated roughly 5 weeks before the burglary, listing a description that made my hands go genuinely cold reading it: diamond and sapphire ring, Victorian setting, appraised at $14,200. My grandmother's ring had never been formally appraised during our entire marriage, as far as I knew, having simply been passed down to me directly from my mother's own estate years earlier, its value understood within our family more through inherited knowledge and sentiment than any formal, documented appraisal process. I sat there in Nathan's office, alone in our quiet house on a Saturday afternoon, holding that receipt, understanding, with a specific, sinking clarity, that this appraisal had occurred 5 full weeks before the burglary that had supposedly, according to the police report I'd myself helped file, stolen that exact ring from our home. I want to describe the specific, methodical process I moved through over the following several days, because I understood, sitting in that office holding that receipt, that I needed to gather considerably more evidence before I said anything to Nathan directly, understanding, with a clarity that surprised even me given how raw everything still felt, that whatever explanation he offered once confronted would very likely be shaped by panic rather than complete honesty if I moved too quickly. Before I actually understood the full shape of what I was dealing with, I called the appraisal shop the following Monday morning, identifying myself carefully and explaining, truthfully enough, that I was trying to locate some jewelry that had recently been stolen from our home, and asking whether they might have any record of similar pieces coming through their shop around that general time. The woman who answered, a soft-spoken employee named Barbara, after checking her records for several minutes while I waited on the line, confirmed that a man matching Nathan's general physical description had indeed brought in a diamond and sapphire ring for appraisal roughly 5 weeks earlier, and had returned 2 weeks after that initial appraisal to consign the piece for sale, along with, she confirmed after checking further, a gold bracelet and a pair of pearl earrings matching the general description I'd provided. I want to describe the specific, physical sensation of receiving that confirmation, sitting alone in my car in a grocery store parking lot roughly 20 minutes after that initial call, because it reorganized, in the space of about 90 seconds, everything I had believed about the worst afternoon of the preceding month. Nathan had not simply had an affair, painful as that discovery alone would have genuinely been to process. He had taken my grandmother's ring, my mother's bracelet, and my own wedding earrings, brought them to a consignment shop 5 weeks before staging an actual, physical break-in at our own home specifically to explain their absence, using our genuinely shattered kitchen window and a fabricated police report to construct an entirely false narrative that placed the blame on some anonymous, unidentified thief rather than on himself. I sat in that parking lot for nearly 40 minutes before I could bring myself to drive home, running through, again and again, every detail of that Thursday afternoon with this new, devastating context now attached to it. The oddly distributed glass. The costume jewelry left behind while the genuinely valuable pieces disappeared. Nathan's specific, slightly performative urgency arriving home that day. Piece by piece, sitting in that parking lot, I assembled a timeline I understood. Even then, I was going to need to verify considerably further before I could act on it with any real confidence. I called the appraisal shop back the following day, this time asking directly whether they could tell me what had eventually happened to the consigned pieces, whether they'd been sold, and if so, to whom, understanding, as I made that call, that I was pushing right up against whatever limits of information a business might reasonably share with someone who wasn't the original client. Barbara, after checking further records and understanding, once I explained the actual circumstances more fully and mentioned, carefully, that this might relate to an active police matter, told me that the ring specifically had not been sold through their consignment service at all, but had instead been purchased back by the same man who'd originally brought it in, roughly 10 days after the initial consignment. A detail that confused me considerably until I sat with it further and understood exactly what that specific purchase likely meant. Nathan hadn't sold the ring for money at all, which had been my initial, somewhat naive assumption. He'd used the consignment shop's formal appraisal and brief consignment period specifically to establish, through legitimate, documented third-party paperwork, an official record of the ring's considerable value and its temporary, documented absence from our home, before buying it back himself roughly 10 days later and, I understood with growing, sickening certainty, giving it directly to someone else entirely. I want to explain the decision I made next, because it required a specific kind of patience I didn't fully trust myself to maintain in that particular moment, sitting with this new, devastating understanding. I did not confront Nathan immediately with what I'd learned. Instead, I called a friend from my college years, Marisol Herrera, who worked as a paralegal at a family law firm across town, someone I'd stayed close with over the years despite our increasingly busy, separate lives, and asked her, carefully, what my options actually were if I suspected my own husband had staged a burglary specifically to cover for both an ongoing affair and the disposal of family heirlooms. Marisol, after listening to the full timeline I'd assembled over the phone, her voice growing increasingly serious as I laid out each individual piece of evidence, told me something that reshaped how I approached everything that followed. If he actually filed a false police report, she said, and used it to file a fraudulent insurance claim, that's not just a marriage problem anymore, Adrienne. That's insurance fraud and filing a false police report, both of which are actual, prosecutable crimes, not just grounds for divorce. You need to be very careful about how you gather the rest of your evidence, because if this ends up in court, either through the divorce or through a criminal matter, you want everything documented properly, in a way that will actually hold up. I retained an attorney the following week, a careful, direct woman named Patrice Okafor who specialized in complex divorce cases involving hidden assets and financial misconduct, someone Marisol recommended specifically because of her experience with exactly this kind of layered, complicated situation. Patrice listened to my entire account during our first consultation without interrupting, taking careful notes, and when I finished, she asked me the same question I imagine she asks most new clients walking through her door carrying this kind of evidence. What do you actually want out of this, beyond simply understanding what happened? I told her, honestly, that I wanted the complete truth first, understanding that I couldn't yet fully answer what I wanted to do with it until I actually had it in front of me, undeniable and complete. With Patrice's guidance, I hired a private investigator, a methodical, unhurried man named Dennis Kowalski, to establish, definitively, whether Nathan's relationship with Celeste Whitfield was genuinely ongoing, and whether there was any direct connection between that relationship and the jewelry's actual current location. I want to describe the specific, somewhat surreal experience of retaining an investigator for the first time in my life, sitting in Dennis's modest, unremarkable office going through the specific details of my own marriage with a stranger whose entire job involved uncovering exactly the kind of secrets I'd never imagined needing uncovered. The investigation, conducted carefully over the following 3 weeks, confirmed considerably more than I had initially suspected or feared. Nathan and Celeste had been involved for just over a year, their relationship apparently beginning during that same work conference in Charlotte the photograph had first hinted at, and roughly 6 weeks before the staged burglary, Celeste had posted, briefly, on a private social media account before apparently thinking better of it and deleting the post within a matter of hours, a photograph of her hand wearing a ring that Dennis's careful, methodical comparison confirmed, based on the setting's distinctive Victorian details and the specific arrangement of the sapphires surrounding the central diamond, was unmistakably my grandmother's ring. Dennis had managed to recover a cached, archived version of that deleted post through a contact he had who specialized in exactly this kind of digital forensics, and I remember sitting across from him in his office, looking at a printed copy of that photograph, feeling something considerably colder settle into my chest than I'd expected, given how much I'd already, by that point, come to suspect. Seeing it, undeniable and specific, still landed with a particular, devastating weight that all my careful, methodical preparation hadn't full braced me for. I sat with that confirmation for a long time after leaving Dennis's office that afternoon, driving home slowly, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost clinical in its precision, exactly what had actually happened during that Thursday afternoon I'd once believed was simply a random, terrifying break-in. Nathan had given my grandmother's ring to his mistress. He had then, apparently anticipating that I might eventually notice its absence, or that some family occasion, a wedding, a holiday gathering, might eventually require the ring to make an appearance, staged an elaborate, physically real cover story, complete with a genuinely broken window and an actual, filed police report, to explain why 3 generations of family jewelry had permanently, apparently vanished from our home at the hands of some anonymous stranger. I confronted Nathan 4 weeks after finding that receipt in his desk drawer, having spent that entire period carefully assembling documentation with Patrice's guidance, understanding, with real clarity, that I needed the complete picture before I gave him any opportunity to construct an explanation specifically designed to minimize whatever this actually turned out to be. I arranged for the conversation to happen at Patrice's office rather than at our own home, a decision I made deliberately, understanding exactly the value of removing any home field advantage from a man who had, apparently, been managing an elaborate, sustained deception for months without my slightest suspicion. I want to describe that meeting in some detail, because it represented the exact moment everything Nathan had carefully constructed finally, completely collapsed. Nathan arrived looking considerably more nervous than I'd seen him in years, glancing repeatedly between Patrice and me as he sat down, clearly sensing, before either of us said very much at all, that this meeting was going to be considerably different from whatever he might have expected. Walking through that door, I watched, over the following 90 minutes, as Patrice laid out the documentation methodically, one piece at a time, the appraisal receipt, the consignment shop's written confirmation, Dennis's careful timeline connecting his relationship with Celeste to the specific timing of the staged break-in, and finally, the recovered photograph of Celeste wearing my grandmother's ring. I watched something in Nathan's posture collapse entirely once he understood exactly how thoroughly this had been documented, exactly how little room remained for any kind of careful, managed explanation of the sort he'd clearly, based on his own initial, halting attempts to respond, hoped he might still be able to offer. "I never meant for it to go this far," he finally said, his voice considerably smaller than I remembered it, and I want to be honest that this specific sentence, more than almost anything else he said during that entire meeting, clarified for me exactly how he'd apparently been thinking about this entire situation throughout its unfolding. Not, "I'm sorry for taking your grandmother's ring." Not, "I'm sorry for lying to the police, or to you." Simply an acknowledgement that the scale of his own deception had exceeded whatever original, smaller, more manageable version of it he'd initially imagined he could sustain. He admitted, over the following hour, sitting across that conference table with Patrice taking careful, precise notes throughout, to breaking that kitchen window himself, using a hammer he'd since disposed of at a hardware store dumpster several towns over, specifically to create the appearance of forced entry before calling me at work that afternoon with a fabricated excuse about needing me to come home to sign for a delivery, ensuring I'd be the one to discover the broken window and call the police myself, rather than him doing so directly, understanding, correctly and coldly, that my own genuine shock and fear would make the initial police report considerably more credible than if he'd been the one to report it himself. I asked him, during that same meeting, whether Celeste had known where the ring actually came from, whether she understood, when he gave it to her, that it belonged to my family, to my grandmother specifically. He was quiet for a long moment before admitting, with what I recognized, even then, as genuine discomfort, that he'd told her it was an old family piece from his own side of the family, a detail that somehow, hearing it, added an entirely separate, specific layer of anger to everything else I was already processing in that room. I want to describe what happened over the following months, because the legal consequences ended up extending considerably beyond our own divorce proceedings, reaching into territory I genuinely hadn't anticipated when I first found that receipt in his desk drawer. Patrice, once we had the complete documentation assembled, advised me that I had grounds not only for divorce with considerable leverage regarding asset division, but potentially for reporting the fraudulent police report and insurance claim to the appropriate authorities, a decision I ultimately made, after considerable thought, understanding that Nathan's actions had exposed our insurance company to a fraudulent claim I had, unknowingly and in good faith, myself initially participated in filing. I want to be honest about how difficult that specific decision actually was, deciding whether to report Nathan formally for the fraud itself, beyond simply divorcing him. Some part of me, even understanding everything he'd done, hesitated at the idea of potentially sending the father figure I'd built an entire adult life around into any kind of formal criminal proceeding. I discussed it at length with both Patrice and, separately, with a therapist I'd begun seeing once the full weight of everything became clear, and ultimately decided that allowing this specific pattern of behavior, staging crimes, defrauding insurance companies, lying to law enforcement, to simply pass without any formal consequence felt like its own kind of moral failure on my part, one I didn't want to carry forward into whatever life came next. The insurance company, once formally informed of the actual circumstances, opened its own internal investigation, and Nathan was ultimately charged with filing a false police report and insurance fraud, charges that resulted, after a negotiated plea agreement his own criminal defense attorney worked out, in a period of probation, mandatory restitution to the insurance company for the full claim amount I had received, and a permanent record that considerably complicated his standing at the law firm where he worked, a firm that, understandably and predictably, took a considerably dim view of an attorney convicted of exactly the kind of fraud his own professional training should have made him acutely, thoroughly aware of the risks of attempting. I want to describe, briefly, what happened to Nathan's professional standing over the following year, because it mattered considerably to understanding the full scope of consequences that eventually followed from that single, initial decision to stage a burglary rather than simply, honestly ending our marriage. His firm placed him on an extended, unpaid leave within weeks of the charges becoming public, and he ultimately resigned rather than face what several colleagues later told me, secondhand, would likely have been a formal termination process. He's since taken a considerably smaller position at a different firm in a neighboring county, one that pays substantially less and offers considerably less prestige than the partnership track he'd been working toward for years before any of this happened. The divorce proceedings that followed secured, with Patrice's careful, thorough guidance, a settlement considerably more favorable to me than a standard, even division might have produced, given the document fraud and the specific, deliberate theft of family heirlooms that had never legally belonged to any shared marital estate in the first place, having been inherited by me individually, long before our marriage, from my own mother and grandmother respectively. I never recovered my grandmother's ring directly, Celeste having apparently sold it herself, according to information Dennis later uncovered, once she understood the full scope of what Nathan had actually done and the considerable legal exposure attached to knowingly possessing stolen, fraudulently obtained property. But the settlement included financial compensation reflecting its documented appraised value, a small, admittedly imperfect measure of restitution for something that had never really been about the money in the first place, but about a specific, irreplaceable thread connecting me to 3 generations of women in my own family. I want to describe, briefly, what happened with my own family once the full truth became known, because their reactions ended up mattering considerably to how I processed everything over the following year. My mother, upon learning that her own mother's ring had been given away to another woman before being staged as stolen, was initially almost entirely silent, a reaction considerably more unsettling, in its own way, than any dramatic display of anger might have been. She told me, weeks later, once she'd had time to fully process it herself, that she'd always considered that ring less as an object and more as a specific, physical thread connecting her to her own mother, gone now for over a decade, and that understanding it had been handled so carelessly, so cynically, by someone she'd trusted as family for over a decade herself, felt like its own distinct, separate grief layered on top of everything else happening in my life at that time. My younger sister, considerably more openly furious than my mother throughout this entire process, insisted on attending several of the divorce mediation sessions simply to sit in the waiting area, she told me, so Nathan would have to see, at least peripherally, that our family understood exactly what he'd done and considered it entirely unacceptable, rather than allowing him any comfortable illusion that this remained simply a private matter between the two of us alone. I moved into a modest rental apartment roughly 2 months after that initial confrontation at Patrice's office, understanding, packing up 11 years of accumulated shared belongings, that I was building, deliberately and carefully, an entirely new chapter of my own life, one that belonged completely and exclusively to me. I remember the specific, strange mixture of grief and relief that first night in that new apartment, sitting on a borrowed air mattress surrounded by boxes, understanding that whatever came next, at minimum, wouldn't involve living inside a lie I hadn't even known I was living inside for considerably longer than I'd originally suspected. I think often, still, about that Thursday afternoon, about the specific, deliberate pattern of glass scattered both inside and outside that kitchen window, a detail some quiet, careful part of my mind had registered as somehow wrong before I consciously understood exactly why. I think about how close I came to never fully understanding what had actually happened, if I hadn't happened to search through old photographs specifically for an insurance claim, if that receipt hadn't been tucked, almost carelessly, in a drawer I rarely had any particular reason to open. I understand, with real clarity now, considerable distance from that specific afternoon, that whatever justice I eventually secured existed specifically because I trusted a small, persistent, quiet unease rather than simply accepting the comfortable, entirely plausible explanation I'd initially, understandably been offered by two kind, professional police officers who had absolutely no reason themselves to suspect anything beyond what the scene in front of them appeared to show. I've rebuilt, over the roughly 18 months since that confrontation, a life I genuinely value on considerably more solid, honest terms than the one I'd unknowingly been living inside before. I purchased a small, modest house of my own roughly a year ago, in a different neighborhood entirely, and had, in one of the specific, small decisions that mattered more to me than its practical significance probably warranted, a locksmith install a genuinely sturdy security system, along with, deliberately, laminated safety glass in every ground floor window, a small, private assurance that whatever happened inside those walls going forward would happen honestly, without any hidden, staged performance layered quietly underneath the surface of ordinary daily life. If you've made it this far with me tonight, I want to ask you something honestly, something I've turned over often in the months since this entire situation finally, fully resolved. If you discovered that a genuine, frightening crime in your own home had actually been staged by someone you trusted completely, specifically to hide a considerably deeper betrayal underneath it, would you have confronted them immediately, the moment suspicion first arrived, or would you have done what I did, quietly, patiently gathering the complete, undeniable truth first, before you ever said a single word out loud to anyone at all? I read every single comment on these stories, and I genuinely want to hear your answer tonight, while this is still sitting fresh with you. Tell me exactly where you're watching from, and tell me honestly whether you think I made the right decision, reporting the fraud formally rather than simply, quietly divorcing him and moving forward without that additional step. And if this story reached something real in you tonight, don't just close this video and move on to whatever comes next in your feed, subscribe right now, because the stories waiting for you here are exactly the kind of stories people tell me, again and again, that they think about for days afterward. I'll see you in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.